Hello, fellow engineers, and welcome back to the 2025 Q1 Science Competition. Today we are featuring chemical science. I've asked the people in my Discord to submit their designs. We have had over 35, or we've had exactly 35 designs that have been submitted and have been tested, evaluated, and have entered the competition. We have, and I'm extremely excited today to talk through all of them. This has been a lot of work to get to this point of actually testing all of these out. And so because of the volume of designs that have been submitted, the way that we're going to go about this competition is going to be the following. So, first off, let me explain how this is going to work. So in round one, we're going to have the qualifiers. So all designs that perform under the baseline are going to be eliminated. So these are going to be short tick tests. We're not going to run the full entire suite of tests. We're going to be running them once, and then anything that's under the baseline are going to be eliminated. This video is going to be covering the first round. I'm going to take some time to talk through those that performed under the baseline and do some analysis and talk through the designs. We have some very unique designs to talk through today, and I'm really excited to mention them. So that's what this video is going to be focused on. Round two is going to be the playoffs. So we're going to have all designs that are performing above the baseline are going to compete against each other. And then finally, the finals is going to be a 1 hour benchmark of 216,000 ticks for the top 5 designs. I'll decide at that point, once I actually run them, how many runs we're going to do to get a decent value for them. But why are we doing that? Well, the reason that I've split it up in this way is because there's a lot of designs that I would like to cover in 3 segments and talk about those that performed under the baseline, because there's some really unique designs that are just cool to showcase, but don't necessarily apply to mega basing. There's also some things that I'd like to do is like more A/B comparisons. So I'd like to do that more in the playoff series and talk through those. And then the top 5 are just like, why were these the most UPS performant? And let's talk about those specifically. Hopefully this way, this video will, instead of being multiple hours long, this will be now in a format that's a little bit more digestible and also keeps it fun because you don't know which one is going to win in the end. Haha. So this science is actually significantly harder to clock stack inserters with than any of the sciences we've seen before. So to demonstrate that, let's do a quick tangent on explaining why this is so difficult and why so many designs ultimately actually just didn't even make it into the competition. So to demonstrate why this science is so particularly hard, I have a nice little demo to explain this around insertion limits. So Flap brought this up in a Discord group and it made me kind of do a deep dive, and then I figured I'd create this diagram to kind of help explain some of the issues that happen and why desync is occurring for chemical science. I've talked previously in videos about the automated insertion limit. So if you've missed that, what is that? So if you look at an individual chemical science pack here, the recipe, the automated insertion limit here is set to 5. You can pretty easily figure this out though too. There is a debug menu setting that you can enable called Show Debug Info in Tooltips. That brings up, when you hover over an assembly machine, on the bottom right-hand corner of my screen right now, you'll see that there is a debug setting for the overload multiplier for this machine. That's set to 5. So it's basically just 5 times the input of that ingredient for that machine. So for sulfur, it's 1 times 5. So 5. 3 times 5, 15, and then 2 times 5, 10. So the reason this becomes an issue is if you start it cold like this, what I want to first talk about is that the diagram that you're seeing in front of you, or this demo here, these inserters aren't actually being clocked at all. So what they're doing is they're relying on wake lists. And so this will work naturally in the game because every single craft that happens, you're going to always be checking, can I put something in there? Now, it's not always going to insert it when it happens to be less than 5 like this. Here's a great example to showcase this. You can see that right now we're at 5. The moment that we drop under it, we're going to be able to go and put it in. There's actually a tips and tricks about this. So if you look at insertion limits, there's a little tooltip that explains this. So the reason that the game includes this is so that it will stop the entity boiler when it has 5 or more items of coal in it. So it does this purposefully so that you can evenly distribute the items along this belt. So if you're fully back pressured, you don't care. But like in the late game and the end designs like this, we don't care. We just want to basically just control it ourselves and just on a clock that we want. But we run into these limitations because, like, here, this doesn't matter in the early game because, like, you probably have, like, a stack inserter size of 4 or, like, 1, and like, you're always under the automated insertion limit that is in here. So it's always going to kind of stop. So that's kind of more of preventing you from overfilling the inputs. Now, in the late game, you are overfilling it drastically because stack inserters can pick up 16 items, and we always want to pick up 16 items if we can. So now you're operating outside the bounds of what the game intends for you to put in here, and it allows you to temporarily overload it like this. So you can always do that, and that's why stack inserters are allowed to pick up items from a belt. So that's why just using stack inserters, period, is just going to be better because there's less swing times. But you just don't have the benefit of reducing the number of decisions because every time it crafts something, they have to decide, can I put something in here? Am I under it? So because we're operating outside of that, I'm going to call this as like you're overloading the assembly machine. So when you're operating in an overload scenario, now you are not cycling around the automated insertion limits. You're actually cycling around the overload that you put into it. So in this case here, we have 5 items that are in here. So you would think, all right, next cycle here, we craft some items. We're going to be able to put items in here. This should be able to do it. Right now, it's actively checking, can I put something in? It decided not to. But why? Well, the reason is because the ratio here, it's saying, hey, you still have enough items in here. So the engine units would translate into you finishing your cycle of 16 items that you've put in. So right now, the engine units, because we're not pulling the chemical science packs out, this is going to now say, hey, you're basically, in the game's mind, you're no longer using this machine. So we're going to just let this naturally get output blocked so that it stops crafting. Otherwise, this machine would craft indefinitely, and nobody wants to have 2 million chemical science packs in the actual machine, right? So that's how the game balances that and says, like, all right, I'm just going to craft up to 32 and be done with it. So what it's really doing here behind the scenes is it's kind of like, it's a little bit more complicated, the logic. So kind of just to demonstrate that, I have these little green marks that show like, hey, the game is actually going to allow you to put it in. So right now the decision's no. And the reason is because right now the chemical science packs are greater than the engine units. So if you just let the game just naturally finish or without putting any more items in here, those 8 engine units would translate into 16 total chemical science packs because of the productivity. But so that would basically mean that in this particular assembly machine, we would have, 16 extra items plus like what is being crafted right now. So the items that are currently being crafted is going to get this to 16, and this would totally stop at 32 total items. So we can even showcase that here by just removing this check mark altogether and then just allowing the machine to finish its craft. So that's what it's trying to do. It's just saying like, hey, in this particular swing, there's no reason to put it in because you're about to be output blocked in the game's mind. So to demonstrate how desyncing occurs, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show this if we are actually controlling this with the same logic, but now actually turning on and off the inserters. So what happens now, in order for this to work, the condition in which your engine units and your sulfur and all these conditions are exactly the same for them to both basically swing back to back. Now these have to be fully in sync. So if I happen to grab a constant combinator here, and I'll just connect this temporarily to this stack inserter so it doesn't move, what I'm going to do is I'm going to temporarily disconnect it. Just enough so that the chemical science gets blocked for a little bit, and we need to basically get it so that we have engine units that are at an off ratio. So I'll put this in here, and I will wait until this crafts again. Cool. So I'm going to go and put this in here, and we'll just let this run. You're going to see that eventually, if we press F5 here, you can see that this gets output blocked. Why did this happen? So if you see like when they're actually crafting, there's 12 engine units in here. There's 18 in here. Basically, and also like the place where they're at in their crafting, this is at 14% and this is at 69%. So that's kind of where these things will get out of sync, is because now there is an offset in terms of their crafting cycle when they happen to pick up and pull items out. And this is really the root cause of the desync. is that by the time that this gets low enough here so that it needs, like, hey, I desperately need more engine units. I could really go for some extra engine units here. Well, this isn't under the automated insertion limit, and the rules don't apply yet. So that's where the desync kind of comes about, is that once you start tightly controlling these, now their cycle of when they pull and grab those items in and out, because it's constantly iterating through these ratios because it's over 16. So it's a cycle of basically 5, 5, and 5. So every 2 out of 3, it'll insert it at the same cycle. So what I mean by that is, like, in order for these to be perfectly synchronized, they'd have to be in the same crafting cycle or so out of sync. So this is exactly 1/3 out of sync, so to speak. So every 3 crafting cycles of 16, they complete a full loop and they get back to the same original, like, conditions where it would have the same number of engine units. And so if you run this, no matter what you do, even if you prevent this basically and you let this all completely back up, you'll see here, like, if we stop this here, this is now at 8, 8 in engine units. This has nothing, and the engine units are off by 8. There's 48 items stacked in here. There's nothing in here. So that's kind of demonstrates here that, like, you're always going to get desynced. Even if you go and add that infinity loader again on here, these are always just going to be out of phase from each other. And so that condition, because we're operating in this overload scenario, you're never going to be able to recover from this, because you will never exactly at the right timing be able to insert it and pull it out and be able to go and overload it. So this plagued not only this design, but it also really impacts engines. So engines have the exact same problem. They have, like, even if you max beacon this thing here, you can see automated insertion limits are exactly the same, 5, 5, and 10. And so you have the same kind of exact desync that can occur from one assembly machine that's inserting into, and pulling stuff in and out of this. And so if those crafting cycles are off, and since we're always overloading it, this can also desync. So overall, the 2 main recipes compound on top of each other the moment that you double insert like this. So you're having a lot of cases where this could be out of phase from another copy of this here. So we could have another copy like this. If this is out of phase with this one, then this one will be out of phase with this one, and you will constantly have, like, compounding desync problems because we're overloading it. So that is why this is so incredibly hard to clock. So if there's a developer out there, a huge feature request that I would I could kiss you if you wind up doing it, would be in the late game, allow us to have a circuit condition where we can set the overload multiplier. If you could do that, and we would opt into, I'm fine with this overstacking in here, that would open up the door for a lot simpler clocking methods for stack inserters that just didn't exist with bulk inserters ever. So, and just to finally completely demonstrate this, I will just put in here just bulk inserters completely to kind of demonstrate that this just becomes not a problem at all once you have bulk inserters in here. So this will eventually get to the point where this will synchronize again and not be output blocked. You can see here it's just output blocked for a second, but it's not a big problem because it can always grab a dynamic amount. And this is why in 1.0, this wasn't an issue. Because you could always you could use a lead follower like this concept, you could use a traditional clock, and none of these problems would occur. Because you could always pull a dynamic amount out. Sometimes it'll grab 12, sometimes it'll grab 8, but it can always grab those items out and it's not an issue. So that's where I'm kind of saying, like, it would be awesome because we're using stack inserters so much in mega basing, if we could just set the overload multiplier ourselves, and then we just never have to deal with, like, half the complexity, because these builds get really complicated at this stage, and they're going to only get more complicated as we go. So that would be my feature request if we could actually do that, and I would just I would love it. But since we don't have that, yeah, it's a problem for this particular science. So hopefully this explanation kind of helps. Alright, so here's the template world that I have set up for all the designs. The way this works, we have raw ingredients. That's been the challenge for this, is you have to be able to use either molten fluids or you're going to have, like molten metals, or and effectively coal, but anything that can be produced locally on Novice is the acceptance criteria for how these designs have to be created. So all the designs have been done that way. So as an example, I'll go ahead and show here is the baseline design that I have created for this. So the baseline that exists for this series is one that, and like all of them in this particular series as we go through the competition, it's something that I can design in about 10 minutes of just sitting down and creating something. I don't do any inserter clocking, nothing like that. This is just quickly creating enough building to supply everything, and then create a design that's going to make 240 items per second. So the whole goal of this whole entire series, you need to make 240 items per second, fully compressing a belt without any belt gaps. Belt gaps is a button that you can press by pressing F5, which will show you then the transport line gaps. You can look at that by typing it in here, and you can see the transport line gaps here, just for a refresher. So, one of the things that we're trying to eliminate, these yellow and green lines, that's a main thing. Another thing is there's going to be kind of a balance. How many of these red, basically how many electromagnetic plants can you make to craft the red circuits that you're going to need? How are you going to be balancing putting everything on a belt? That's how I particularly did it here. Or are you going to use it with basically direct insertion? Are there ways to do that? And what I will say is the biggest challenge that exists here, and as we progress to more complicated sciences, is we are going to be getting into a point where layout is going to matter a lot more than the specific clocking methods that exist. So the layout and where there is high flow through. So the highest flow through item in this entire design here, and for chemical science, is your basically how you're handling copper cables. That's the highest volume that is going through. So in this particular design, as a choice that I have for the baseline, running them on a belt is a really bad decision. Because it would be much better to directly insert them into the high volume consumers here. So the high volume consumers, 311 a second to craft basically these red circuits. Yes, this is overkill because we only need 90 or so, but you can kind of get the idea that you need a lot of them. You also need a lot to produce the green circuits. So like in general, you're gonna just need a lot of copper. So how do you deal with that? So where to focus on optimization, the first thing that I would suggest is focus on your high flow through items. Those are gonna be your highest transfer rate. So if you have inserters that are constantly putting items onto a belt, that's probably not a good idea. Just throw them directly into the machine that you're going to need. Second thing is maxing out how many beacons are you using versus the actual machine. So, okay, I think I've given a good enough intro here. So this is basically what a baseline design is. So this passes all of my tests. So the test that I wind up doing is it needs to be able to produce at a very bare minimum from a cold start. It needs to be able to craft basically the science that comes out here. So that's the first acceptance criteria. So I'm going to take a design, and I will use my own design as an example for this. The way that this one particular design works is in order to pass the acceptance criteria, it has to follow a couple things. So in my case, I have a multi-stage build, so that kind of goes outside of the bounds of basically the tests that I wind up doing. But the way that it has to basically work, and let's make sure that I've got mine here, is, so mine's a multi-stage design. What I mean by multi-stage designs, that just means that I have blueprints that change circuit logic. So in this case, I'm waiting until all of these particular assembly based machines here complete the output block, and they go and have enough back pressure here. So that takes a little bit to fully create back pressure. Cool, we have enough engine back pressure here. I can go ahead and enable everything. So I do that. I'll cover this a little bit more in depth later as we get more into the series, but the main point is there's a priming sequence that's done here, and then finally, okay, great, we can go ahead and create it and start everything up. So I'll delete the things that are unnecessary now that I've said that I'm allowed to delete based on the check marks. Okay, and then let's just run this. So this is now going to be producing 240 items per second. So the first test that I do, and I do this for every single design that I have, is I stop production and I wait until everything is fully backed up, so nothing is running anymore. The next thing that I do is then I undo that, and I see if this will, for the next minute or so, will have any belt gaps. If it has it for a second, I don't care, but if it consistently is stuttering, then that fails the first test. The second test that I do is I cut off the input supplies, so I do them one at a time. A lot of designs failed this test right here. You remove the actual molten iron from the whole design, and then I let it completely drain until there's nothing left in the design here. Why do I care about this? This can happen quite often. So if, for example, in this particular baseline build that I have here for the template, if I run out of calcite because I have a bad shipment, in that particular case, we're going to have a case where, all right, we don't have that fluid anymore. And then if your design is completely bricked, where now you're not going to go and produce those items anymore, that's a bad scenario to be in, because that means that, like, if I have to go and delete this whole build because there's an imbalance in terms of the items that are currently inside these assembly machines here, that's going to be bad for me, because that means that I can't anymore, if I do have this imbalance, I can't anymore go and produce a constant 240 items per second. So I'll go ahead and go and undo what I did, and I'll explain that. What I want to happen is the moment that I add that resource again, the science here that is coming out is going to be, again, 240 items per second. All I need is that it has to happen within a 5-minute period, eventually restabilizing. A lot of designs never destabilize again because these assembly machines, like we talked about in the intro, desync. So that's why I care about that. And then effectively what I do for the rest of these is I just basically do the same thing. I take all the inputs one at a time, bring them back, and I go and I check basically the output here, making sure that it's constantly on an output. The next thing, and then basically do that for all of them. Water, like, there's almost zero chance that you're ever going to lose water. I tested it anyway, just to basically do it. But if a design actually failed it, then I wouldn't have a problem with it, because it's like you're realistically never going to lose water. But in reality, like, you would most likely fail on basically on iron before you would fail on water. So then if I remove then basically the crude oil, do it again, monitor that you basically have no gaps in the transport line on the end. And that's how I basically evaluate these designs. That's how they have to accept, like, acceptance criteria in order to make it into the competitions. You have to be able to do that. So, and then the final test that I wind up doing is I just take all the inputs here and I take them all away at the same instance, wait until the build basically completely runs out, and then undo it again and monitor the output for any gaps. So I do that for every single resource, do that, and if they accept that all those things are accepted, great. Then it's considered a design. And then I wind up, for every person that has submitted a design here, I have gone and taken their design in their particular order, and then I hook it up to this fluid bus if they're using all these fluids, and then I create 8 copies of them. So I'll show you, for example, here is a, well, let me go and open up the correct one here. So here's an example, which is design 1 from Undertow. So the way that I have this set up is every single one of these batches are going to be creating, basically, there's going to be 8 lanes of this material. So they're going to be making 8 fully stacked lanes of chemical science. And that is the criteria for what they have to do. So the design's ultimate goal here is to say, okay, this is going to be a copy, and I take this, and then I region clone this using Region Cloner, and I basically go and you can use the selection tool and you can select all of this area here, and then you can go in here and you go and shrink the selection, and then I wind up just going and saying I'm going to copy this clone 12 times to the north. Now I use a hotkey for this so I don't have to do this every time, but the main point is that's what I wind up doing. So I take this is the template, I copy it 12 times to the north, and you can see this here. Here's the remnants of the old build. What I do is I copy this 12 times with the game paused. I then delete all of the original copy, and that way it makes sure that every single entity, because the moment you copy it, it goes 1 tick forward into the future. So what I do then is I say, okay, I'm going to copy this 12 times, go to the north, and then I'm going to say, cool, I'm then going to start it. What I wind up doing is I save it in that snapshot in that instance. Then I go and I run the game for an hour's worth of production, which happens for most of these designs relatively quickly. So I'll go ahead and I will show the FPS indicator up here. So I wind up doing this, and we'll go and I'll move myself over here so I can just kind of stare at nothing. I read this run for a while and I watched the statistics here. The main acceptance criteria that I have is this needs to be able to run stably for an hour. And that's if they make it to the final stages, I need to be able to run a full 216,000 tick test. And I can't do that if the design can't produce a consistent amount of science over that period of time. So I just monitor here that it's going to be creating enough science basically on the average over 10 minutes. And that means that I know guarantee that all the designs are not going to have any stability problems. And so if you think about it, we have 8 lanes worth times 12 copies times 240 per second times 60 in a minute. That means that per minute we're making 1.382 million science, right? So that's the only stat that I'm looking at here. So if it can go and produce that, which we're seeing this is consistently doing, then this passes my first 10-minute test. Then I just let the test run until it gets to the hour mark. I basically go step away from my computer, go do something else. But then once it can actually get to the hour mark, I say, great, this is now acceptable. This is now at a point where I can say that this is now a good copy. I then save it, record it, and put it in my log. That's what I've done, and I've done that at this point 36 times for all the different designs that we have. So now that you know kind of hopefully this kind of gives an idea of like the amount of work that goes into this, and you can accept that, and not accept, but you can appreciate it, because we're going to get into the benchmark data now, and that just to demonstrate that the amount of work that goes into going and creating all the designs that you're seeing here is not a small effort. So I do this painstakingly because right now I want to make sure that that all the designs match that acceptance criteria that I have, but also I want to make sure that every time we go and benchmark these things, we have reliable data, because that's the whole point, is we're trying to create something where we can consistently see how are these designs performing against another one, and then ultimately what can we learn from it. One last thing that I will say, thank you to every single person that has submitted a design. So like, I know how much work goes into these designs because I myself created one, and I know the amount of tedious labor that goes into going and optimizing this. So I will say just encouragement, even if your design doesn't become one of the top performers, we're going to learn something from each design. So you can hold your head up high. Just thank you so much for doing it and participating in this competition. And I'm just very honored that I get to host it. So thank you for allowing me to have this opportunity to do this. Okay, so this page here covers all the designs that have been submitted. This is going to be included in the video description below. This is a page that you can refer back to at any point in time if you want an overview of the entirety of the competition. So this first one is just going to include the results from the first round for the qualifiers, and then also lists all the individual designs that have been submitted, whether they passed the test or failed the test. So the first section here is going to cover all the validation criteria, which we just covered. One thing that I didn't mention, there's a lot of RS latches that are in these designs. So what is that? That's basically for starting and stopping the petrol processing. So for any single time that these machines are going to be starting and stopping, there's a lot of them that are controlled just using an RS latch. And the main reason is just that they're not running all the time. They're only running when they're like under that 80% fluid threshold. So a lot of designers have opted for that. So for that reason, each of these different designs have a very different period for when they have a large high period and a large or a low period. This is not only applied for the fluids, it's actually been applied to a lot of different concepts in the design. So that's the reason why I've been doing the stability test, making sure they can run for an hour, so that if they do actually qualify and move on to round 2, which we'll get into here in a second, for those designs, they do need to be able to run for an hour so that in case they do get into the top 5, we can run those tests. So first round, after some feedback that I got from the automation, or not the automation science, well, actually, let's take that back. Both in red and green science, both of those sciences, one of the feedback that I got was, hey, the design index is confusing. So I was using just a number. That's how I wind up just referring to it. And I just kind of go through the order. It helps me keep track of each individual design. What I've done to make it a little bit easier for us to follow is I've included the number. So it's just a number. It helps me remember it's the order of submission. But the second part is the actual author who wound up creating that design. So then that way, when we look at all the graphs and everything, you can at least know who the author was, and you can know what that basically how they wound up placing and those kinds of things. So hopefully this will help us remember a little bit more who designed what, and also just keeping some order for all these designs. So everyone who submitted something, we had 36 submissions. Each of these, what I've done is I've included now a screenshot, so that this way when we go and look at them, it's not just a number and a name, but there's also a screenshot that's included that is an overview of the exact design, so that you can kind of get an idea of like how many beacons there are, if there's silo chesting, if there's basic cargo wagon chesting, etc. And so that gives you kind of an overview of what that design looked like. Some of these designs are very different than others. So some of them are extremely long. There's a couple that are using trains, and I didn't think that we'd see the day, but we have unfortunately seen the return of using silos as silo chesting. So on one hand, I love this concept. On the other hand, this is actually a real big pain to benchmark. I'm gonna take a quick segue on that here in a second, but like this adds some complexity. So the testing for this particular design is actually a special case that I am going to try to rule out here for this competition, because it's actually the only one that did actually wind up creating silo chesting. So actually, you know what? Let me show you what I mean by that and why this actually winds up being different. So here's the save file for that specific design. So the reason why I'm pointing this out is the true cost of silo chesting isn't the silo itself. It actually is a fantastic chest because you can easily go and like connect actual circuits to it, and it's actually better than a traditional like cargo wagon. Because like the cargo wagon, you know, you can't actually, you have a lot of slots that you can put in here, but you can't actually hook up circuits to it. So this is in theory a really good design to use. However, there's a big downside to using this, and it's because we're on Novice. So in the late game, you're gonna have a bunch of ships over Novice. So now all of a sudden, each of these have behind the scenes a check that they're communicating with the ships that happen to be orbiting above the planet. And so the more ships you have, the worse this effect is. So for that reason, thanks to you, I have to create all these extra ships that are above Novice. So I created these. I have 5 of them. The way that this is going to work is I have 2 different save files. So this one here specifically has all the copies of the design, same as all the other ones, creating 96 lanes. However, this is going to be design number 16 from you that winds up having no ships above it and one with ships above it. And so for that reason, the one that actually happens to have ships above Novice is going to compete against another version that I've created of the baseline that actually does have ships as well orbiting Novice. So this is the only one that's going to be competing against this. The way that I'm going to do this is that, okay, let's say design 16 here from you winds up going and performing better than the baseline. Well, then it's going to have to perform better than the baseline in both cases. It has to perform better than the baseline with no ships above Novice and with having 5 of these ships above Novice as well. So the ships are the same. They're not making any requests for any items, but one of the things that they are requesting, so like, for example, the reason why this interaction kind of exists is because anytime you wind up going, let's say I started to ask for advanced circuits, well, you're going to see that there's nothing here for this particular design, right? So there's nothing that it actually would be requesting. So there's no overhead because there's no silo chests on Novice at all. However, on the other design that we just showcased, for this design, all the requests that are happening here in space, if I wind up actually now going and saying, okay, advanced circuits, even though I'm not requesting anything, you're going to see that there's like 14,000 that are available currently in rocket silos. So why is that number constantly going up and down? Well, it kind of makes sense if you look at any of these chests. There's constantly a few items that are constantly in here, so there's always 16 items to fill each of these individual, basically by moving it around as a chest and going to the other, basically items that are here. So this works actually really well. That's just my point, is it has to be able to pass both of those. So that's the first special consideration that we have. The second special consideration that we have is design number 31 from Mind Builder. This one is the most unique design that we have. The Mind Builder is actually going through right now in his own playthrough a complete only using burner, basically. So anything that's only considered to be burners. So if for that reason, because of that challenge run that he's doing, he wanted to ready anyway, just submit it. And I said, sure, we can do it for this, probably this one time. I'm not personally very interested specifically in designs that are going to be obviously not great for mega basing, but I wanted to showcase this design because of just absolutely how unique it is. So for that reason, one thing that's different about this design compared to all the other ones, where all of the other ones have 96 copies, one difference about this version instead is that it winds up actually having only, basically it's going to have 1/12 of the copies. And the main reason is that the performance, when I wound up just already trying to generate all 96 effectively like lanes of this, because just one of these designs, these giant designs here, let me slow this down, creates 240 per second, which is in and of itself an amazing achievement for this design. The fact that it's using directly just smelting here like legendary furnaces and is going and crafting basically everything that you're seeing here, and also just keep in mind it's using actual legendary burners inserters. So this is a kind of an amazing thing to look at. I can't imagine just how much time this took to actually go and design. So just kudos for figuring this out. And had also like the most unique clocking method that I've ever seen. There's no constant combinators and decider combinators or anything creating clocks. It's actually just monitoring this coal belt that goes around, and actually MineBuilder had to go and specifically create a startup sequence so I didn't have to bootstrap this on my own. So the build just starts because it actually technically passes the tests that I asked for. So this is it's an amazing achievement in and of itself, even if this doesn't perform as great, but I wanted to still let it have at least a spot in this competition, even if it's only producing 1/12 of the total science output as the rest of the designs. So we'll cover this more in depth, but just wanted to first just kind of this is just an amazing thing just to look at. So anyway, so that's the only other special consideration that we have. So that leaves us with 28 total designs that have passed the benchmarks themselves. So, or at least the tests that I wound up creating. There's a total of 36 designs that have been submitted. Unfortunately, some of them just didn't pass the tests, wound up going back and forth with the designers, giving them a chance. Some of them, if you see their name again populated here in the designs, it means they had an updated revision. But if I went and did the work to go and test it, I included the reason. So a lot of them failed losing molten iron. That was the most common failure case. Some of them just failed to produce 240% consistently. Some of them just failed to start up. So there was just different reasons for why they happened. And so if they didn't meet the acceptance criteria, they wound up getting ruled out. So out of the 28 that move on from the original elimination, there's 8 that wound up just not making it. So there's some of the things that I want to just make sure is just that we always just make sure that we test those things and make sure that the criteria is met, so that otherwise the design won't be able to actually be featured in the competition. So overall, though, we have a really good distribution of lots of different methods. So I think we still have well over the number of sample cases that we're going to need to actually go and do these tests. So as we get into the results of the round 1 qualifiers, I want to make an important note. The results from this round are really only going to be used to determine which designs perform over the baseline. The results are just completely inconclusive, though, because there's just so many RS latches that are present in these designs, and some of them have a very short window where they have a very high peak in max consumption. And you see that across a lot of these designs where they have an overall average that's good, but then very large spikes in overall max consumption. And so that's kind of a pattern that's all over the place. So we want to make sure that we run these for a longer period of time, because some of them have those spikes occurring every 90 seconds or so, and they last for 5 seconds or 6 seconds. So for that reason, we just need a much longer sample rate to determine anything in terms of like an actual overall winner. But in order, like basically creating a period of 5 minutes worth of ticks is plenty to basically say, are you over or under the baseline? So here are the raw results. Let's go, and I'm going to start with design 16 by you, which was silo chesting. And I'm going to start with that one first because I made that as a special call out. So design 16 is the only one that incorporates silo chesting. So for that reason, we've compared both 16U against the baseline and 16U against its ship counterpart. So I've updated all my charting libraries to generate these beautiful charts for us so that we can actually look at A-B comparisons. So I wound up actually including the space platforms this time. And the main reason I'm including that is so that you can see just how bad it is to use silo chesting when you actually happen to have just 5 space platforms orbiting Novice, not requesting anything from the surface. So what you're seeing here is you have so the Design 16 by you actually performed over the baseline by about 10% an improvement over it. So the methods and like just not even using really like some of the clocking methods and stuff, it wound up actually just performing better because of just direct insertion overall. So it was already like a 10% improvement over it. However, on the flip side, the moment that we started to see the orbits happening, this big, huge orange section here is effectively the space platform update time. So you can see here the baseline with ships, we do have some space platform update time, but it's only like 4 microseconds that it's taking. However, because of the silo chests, that's up to 714 microseconds. The ships are exactly the same. They're doing nothing else. They're doing nothing. They're not requesting anything, but there's just that base update rate. So this leads to a very obvious conclusion, which I had alluded to in previous videos, but now can very definitively say that, yeah, silo chesting is great, as long as you don't have any ships very often hovering over your particular planet. So it's probably not so bad on a planet like Aquilo or a planet like Fulgora if you don't have ships over there very often. However, if you're Novice, well, Novice is always going to constantly have ships because it's going to be your central port in the late mega basing late game like that. So, yeah, so that for that reason, even though it did perform above the baseline, unfortunately, this one is one of those designs that did fall below the baseline and was eliminated because it had to match both those acceptance criteria. So the next part that this leads me into is now we get to see all the designs here and their overall distribution across all the runs. So the first thing that I want to point out here is I've changed the format for how I display this. This is going to be from the worst design to the best design. The main thing that we care about here is just this baseline design, this one right here. So anything that performed above it just passes on to the next round. Anything that performed worse than that is eliminated right after this point. One of the things that I want to talk about right now is you're seeing this variances here. I've actually done a deep dive into this and why I'm seeing the variance that I have. So let's take a quick segue on that, because I would like to explain why there's variances between some of these benchmarks. So last week I noticed that I have a lot of variations in my particular benchmarks. Got a lot of comments and suggestions on how I could improve this and fix this. Most of them are wildly overcomplicated, like going and doing Fourier transformations, and also non-helpful, like saying, hey, just go and switch to Linux. Sure, I run Linux all the time in my day job, but like that's not what I want to do practically. I don't want to run Linux for like half the stuff I do for gaming, and I have almost all my tooling set up in Windows, so it's a non-starter to just say just go to Linux because it's better. What I want to say is like there's so many people out there that use Windows for testing things and benchmarking. There's a lot of people that use Linux. I'm going to choose Windows, and I'm going to say, well, let's go and continue to mess with it until we can try to figure out how we can reduce the variations that are happening. This is not an OS level thing. So what's really going on, I have like TLDR, basically I did some analysis, and what I said that I did, I posted this on the Technical Factorio Reddit channel, and also on the Discord server that they have. So I posted in both of those different places, basically this summary and analysis, so feel free to go to my GitHub page and go and see that. But the main things that I wound up basically seeing is that running your fans at max speed is good, disabling your CPU boosting mode is really good because I have a 7800X3D, that processor boosts temporarily to have a higher speed, and that also increases your standard deviation across runs. These are basically four just random runs that I have, and then that's basically what I wound up noticing was just disabling that's better. So I'm doing that going forward. The other thing is I'm always going to be running random order, even though grouped, or like rather basically doing everything in a group. So always running the first design first, the second design for the number of runs you have. So it'd be design 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 4, 4, etc. I wind up basically saying that, okay, that reduces the standard deviation, but that also implicitly creates temporal bias. What do I mean by temporal bias? I mean that when a design is going to be run, let's say for 5 minutes, and then the next one runs for 5 minutes, if I have a background process that kicks off for that full 5-minute period, I won't notice it. I will have no idea to know if test 1 and test 2 both suffered from that problem, or is just test 2 that much better. So I'd rather just run them all in a random order because it balances kind of the chaotic performance that sequential has, and also just kind of balances between the random or rather the sequential ordering and the grouped ordering. So I'm always going to do that. So posted this TLDR. That's how I'm going to be doing this going forward. I'm always going to run them in random order, set the fan speed manually to 100%, and disable CPU boosting. Then the other thing that I'd also suggest that I still have to implement as we get into later designs is removing all runs that fall outside the 95th percentile per save file. So why does that happen? So actually we use all these designs here that we talked about as an example to explain this. So the first thing that I wound up noticing is that the baseline itself, I wound up going into Windows and I wound up basically setting the affinity for Factorio by default using an external program called Process Lasso. And I wound up basically just going and saying, okay, Factorio is going to be always on the best core that I have because I've clocked it. I know which core is my best. So I'm just basically going to lock the affinity to the two threads in hyperthreading that one core particularly has. So I ran that. So what I wound up seeing then is when I ran with just basically one core, if you look at this, the distribution of values here, A, the order of the designs change. I'll address that in a second. But B, your variations drop down. So the question was like, well, why is that? Well, when you boot up Factorio, Windows is going to basically decide which particular core is going to be the lucky one that gets the main thread. Care about the main thread the most because that's where all your entity update time is happening. Single-threaded, one game loop that's happening. All the multi-threading stuff is for transport line update time, electric circuit, heat and fluid circuit updates, and then control behavior updates. So those are all multi-threading world. And so you can see very clearly here that when I ran actually all the designs this way, and I'll post all these results so you can see them, is that the baseline, when it ran, the overall update time shot up significantly. And that's because, and this is what you would expect, that across these runs, your entity update time would be fairly consistent. And then when you wind up going and saying that as you increase the number of threads that are available, your transport line update time, electric circuit fluid heat update time, should all slowly go down. And so because the number of threads that those processes have, now they can run those parallel computing of what's going on with transport lines and keeping those updated. So although, yeah, great. This changed and basically reduced the variations that are coming from selecting an odd core that isn't the best. That's also not representative actually what is happening in a real game, because sure, you can build a computer that's only going to have a single core on it, but most computers are going to have multiple cores. And then on top of that, if you're building megabases, you want to use as many threads as you possibly can to eliminate and reduce your transport line updates. You can see that there's kind of like diminishing returns on this, but the point is like you're going to want to have at least 4 cores or more. So there's a balance to that. I'm not going to get in totally and tell you what parts you want to buy. There's separate places for that, but that's kind of where I'm going is like, if you look at this in a nutshell, if I wind up I'm always just going to run the best core. That's going to bias designs that have the lowest entity update time and lowest transport line update time and control behavior update time. And actually, you're going to want to use less circuits if you're running just on a single core because there's nothing to parallel compute. So if you see that, then you're going to see that the designs that wound up actually performing better all of a sudden were the ones that flip-flopped and had less control update time. So just to quickly show that here, you can see that number 1 from Undertow here happens to have a very low control behavior update time. When I ran the actual benchmark that I had for all the cores that I have, and we will show this one. If I compare them, you're going to see that particular design actually performed a lot worse. And that's mainly because it's more biased towards running less on the overall entity update time and more the balance of all of these things, because now all these designs beforehand that basically have almost next to nothing transport line update time and electric fluid and control behavior updates are now exploded when you only run it on one core, because now those that were more heavy to reduce the entity update time, now that behavior is exacerbated by the amount of threads that the reduction is now there. So anyway, that's my findings. I wanted to explain kind of the variances, ways you can do it, and what you can do to kind of circumvent it. But when you see this, the main reason that you're going to be seeing now in the main designs, that you're going to see this run distribution that's going to be a little bit higher, is because, well, that particular design got unlucky. For this particular case, the one that really got unlucky is this design by 19 Where's Wolf. However, even the best run of it didn't get close to the baseline. So I don't feel like it's necessary to rerun this, but the main point that I'm trying to say is as we get towards, and this is why we're doing this phases, as we get towards especially eliminating the 5% on these top runs that are here, and you can see kind of like this very small kind of variations that are happening now, that's where I'm going to say, okay, these are just going to need a lot more runs so that they have a higher chance of actually getting on the best core and the best threads and the best run without any background noise, etc. So more runs will get us closer to having a normal distribution. That's my thoughts on variance. That's how I'm going to approach it. So we've determined now this is our whole update time in microseconds. I've switched to this over the UPS metric because I find it personally more accurate or a little bit easier to think about. Like how much time is each individual tick taking and on average across the entirety of the run. So this kind of helps me to visualize this. So compared to before where UPS, the bigger the number it was, the better. This is the inverse. This is just basically the lower the number. So golf rules, the lower the number is, the better it's going to be. So then what this means then now is if you look at this now, if you isolate this from the outliers that were here, and we look at just the ones that performed above the baseline, yeah, there's still some variance here, but that will start to get eliminated as we get and do more runs for a longer period of time. And that's what the second stage of this competition is going to be. So if you see this then here, you can see a nice kind of distribution of we are like, what's really interesting here is like these top 4 designs are very close to each other. There is a large kind of delta here. And what I'm excited about is in the second round for us to dive into why like this particular range, why this has a step, and then what's this next step here, what's this next step, and then all the way down here. So if we look at this here, what's interesting to me is now that I've enabled the train statistic because of one design, which we'll talk through a little bit, that actually used trains full on for their basically for delivering all the items. I actually noticed kind of a really interesting thing. So all the designs that used trains as chests wind up having this little yellow icon that's showing up. That means that there is an update, like basically in time update that is attributed to trains specifically that is being used whenever you're using trains as a chest. So just like we saw with space platforms having a cost when you're using silos as a chest, there's also a train cost when you're using chests. However, it seems to not be that bad, as at least for this, again, just take this with a grain of salt, that the best design in this particular run happened to be from Lady Mayneth, and that one happens to be using an actual chest with as a cargo wagon. So cargo wagon tech ain't bad. So, and what's actually interesting to me is that the top 3 designs are wildly different in terms of how they implement it. So mine in particular here is using recipe switching. This is a traditional, more like direct insertion design from Flap. And this is also using a direct insertion design, but using silo chesting to produce the raw materials. So kind of interesting that we're seeing that there's 3 totally different ways to actually do this, but it seems like there's more layout dependent. Anyway, that's just my initial thoughts on it. So for the ones that performed below the baseline, so we talked about the design 16 by you, even though it performed above the baseline, it's included in here, but actually in reality, performed substantially worse below the baseline because of the space platform update time. So what I want to do is I would like to say goodbye to the designs that have been here and talk about why they wound up performing worse than the baseline itself. And we'll cover that here in next. So for all the people that have passed and moved on to round 2, I'll talk about your designs in the next video. But for now, for the ones that got eliminated, we're going to talk through these designs. So we're going to talk about the 7 designs that didn't make it, and then we'll go through the 20 designs in the next stage, and then eventually to the top 5 designs, whatever comes out of round 2. So with that, I'll see you as we talk about each design in descending order. So the first design that we're going to talk through performed 5% worse than the baseline. This is the design number 4 by Swift Death 07. So The reason why this one wound up performing a little bit worse is mainly due to a couple concepts that I want to quickly highlight. So, one of the things the design did well is it used a lot of direct insertion. One of the problems, and we can see that by just comparing the individual time series graphs. So we have the baseline here. You can see that what this design did is it reduced the entity update time, if we look at over here, compared to the previous design. But one of the things that it did is it just basically added more control behavior update time than it took away from the entity update time. And so if we look at the preview here, and if we look at the individual numbers, you can see that although the entity update time for this particular design dropped by about 100, 200 microseconds here, the control behavior update time increased by more than that. So it wound up having 140 that it increased by. And so if you look at just the overall graph here, the baseline, it performed slightly worse because it had a higher transport line update time and also just had a massively much larger control behavior update time. And it kind of stems from one specific reason why there's so much more control update time. So the reason that manifests itself is because all the circuits here, one of the things that they're doing is they're not guarding the circuits. So each time that you're seeing one of these inserters here, they have to make a decision across a global network that has a constant changing of both the clock, all these individual values that are all constantly changing. And so it's not really changing what decisions it has to make, the inserter per tick. It's just effectively to actually increase the number of decisions it has to make because the network is constantly changing, and so the values that it has to check has increased. The much better way to do this is to just send a single check mark or just one value that says, hey, go and output something. And that can be done by guarding the signal. So, because if each of these are then effectively acting like a decider combinator, and they have to make a decision every single tick if they have to do something or not. And having the extra noise in the network just kind of compounds that effect and makes it worse. So that's the main reason that this design ultimately performed worse than the baseline, is because it's doing a lot of the same concepts of belting materials. It is doing direct insertion, which is good. And it's using some of the cool concepts that we used in the past, which was like, using epic inserters to always have constant output here. But then, yeah, again, kind of the same pattern, just a global network clock decision making. So guard the network, then you won't have kind of those performance issues anymore. The next design that we have is design 20 by Tota 1. This is 5% worse than the last design that we just talked about. The main thing that jumps out at me is just immediately just the sheer size of this build and the amount of beacons that wind up just impacting like one component. And there's not a lot of sharing of beacons. So the first reason why that kind of matters when you think about this, before we even talk about the sheer number of entities, if we look at this graph that I have here, so the first thing that I will kind of talk about is I did a deep dive. I created 720,000 beacons so that I could just observe what they're doing. And there's a very clear, obvious thing that every 120 ticks, they're going to perform some sort of an operation. And the operation that they're performing is, I was talking with Dave McW, who's got source access, and he wound up saying that it looks like every 120 ticks, that's the event when the beacons recalculate their bonuses to handle brownouts. So this recalculation that's going on is not free. Although it seems free, but then once you start adding it and you're not sharing it, you're not necessarily getting as much of a gain from it. So that particular info is kind of useful because that basically means that because of the way this is tiled, especially with the number of cargo wagons that are here, you're not sharing a lot of beacons. And that's kind of a downside to cargo wagon designs, and especially in this particular implementation. So, like, ideally, one of the nice things if you compare, let's say, this design against the benchmark baseline is just that every single beacon here is sharing at least 2 different designs. And then especially when you copy this, right, the beacons are, or could be, with a little bit better placement, even shared even more. So the nice thing about that is that we know every 120 ticks, they're going to do a recalculation of what their current, in case of a brownout, and what their distribution effect is. So for that given reason, if you're not getting enough tick updates to reduce the speed of a machine to balance out the 120, basically those ticks that like that beacon's going to make a decision, you're going to get hurt in the long run. And that kind of shows up a bunch of times here for this particular design because, you know, like the speed of all of these things, this can make 423 items a second. This is consuming 4.9 per second. And then finally, and then even on top of that, and is producing 9.81 per second. And so this is then only consuming 5.2. So everything is wildly over ratioed here. So if you look at this, we are order of magnitude higher. So we're not really making a good efficient use of the beacon layout and then also of the individual foundries. So that's the main thing that hurts this design. Is this is a nice little module for sure. The downside is then it has extra trains. So that's also not allowing for direct insertion. Like if this is all full direct insertion here, cool. Like I could understand doing it this way. But the downside just here is just that these cargo wagons aren't really being used as a shared resource. So that's kind of where I kind of would tend to go towards now is if you're going to use cargo wagon tech, use it as more of a shared resource to hit multiple different buildings. So the more that you can reduce the number of entities, the better. Because like if you look at this build as a whole, it's very large, but the main thing that jumps out at me is there's 370 inserters, 670 beacons, right? Whereas the baseline here has 147, so that's half the inserters. Sure, they're pulling off the belt, but they are about half the amount of inserters are there, but a third of the number of beacons to do the same job. And then also, if you look at the foundries, there's 7 foundries there, and there's 115 here. And so if we go back and look at like the graphs again, main thing that immediately jumps out if you compare this is just there's a lot of the cargo chesting that's going on, cargo wagon tech, and that adds an overhead for every single tick where you can see that inserters are doing something, pulling something in and out of them, and there's just a train overhead that comes from that. And so it's good to use occasionally, I think, but in this particular case, just using it as an extension of an arm is just not worth it. So that, and then just because of the sheer number of foundries that are per design, the like fluid flow is just much higher. And caveat, this design particularly also uses technically the advanced oil processing, so I can't exactly say that that's the root cause, but I don't think that necessarily, for example, this extra pump is needed. So just in general, like looking at this whole design in its core, we have a little bit just too many things that are here to do the same job. So this is where using a little bit better efficient use of beacons, less buildings overall, we have legendary buildings, let's use them, is kind of highlighting that we need to, that's like the main reason that's causing the issues that we have here. The next design is design number 19 by Where's Wolf. So this particular design wound up performing about 10% or about 8% worse than the previous one. So the main delta that we wound up seeing in this particular design compared to the previous was that now, although it had not as high of an entity update time, it now had a pretty high control network update time. And it overall had slightly higher entity update time than the baseline that I created. And it actually had, but then overall, so it was close to the baseline in terms of that, but then it had a very high control behavior update time. So it actually suffers from a very similar behavior, and here's just the overall time series graph that you can see. If you look and flip between the two here, you can just see the elevation that's coming from just the entity updates and control behavior update time. So just a very large control behavior update time. But why is this happening? So the main reason that this exists is it's doing a pretty clever concept here, where it effectively just sets, here are the conditions, and we're combining on one global network all the values, and then it will read with 2 network signals, currently what exists in the assembly machine versus what it needs to grab. So it's constantly combining, in this case, the green signal that exists with the red signal itself. So this, as mentioned in the design by Swift Death, it has the same problem, but now it's doubled because now it has 2 networks that it's actually reading from. And surprisingly, combining signals across a network actually has a pretty high cost in terms of that decision that it has to make. So that's why, like, each of these now further, not only are they monitoring the individual building, so constant circuit updates, but it's also combining the signals across the other network. So although this removes a constant combinator, it doesn't go and remove the decisions the inserters have to make. So now the control update time just spiked. And that's consistent across the entirety of the build, is these little decisions that are being made are all by combining the two values that are coming across the network. And so they wind up having to make that decision all the time. So it's a really cool concept, but just unfortunately that particular pattern is actually hurts overall. So it's actually a good lesson for me, because I wind up using this a lot on Bulgora for a lot of the logical decisions that I make, and it would be probably better to set filters with a decider combinator than it would be to making these decisions specifically with like combining circuit networks. So it removes like a decider combinator that you need to make it one decider combinator, but then it adds the combination across two networks, and that cost is apparently very high because it uses it across this entirety of this build. So it's a cool concept. Like, I liked how modular this build was. There's like a dedicated fluid section, there's a dedicated engine processing gear area. It's all connected with one network, so it's really cool how this is all kind of comes together. Just the unfortunate part is just, yeah, the circuit network overhead just like overall did it in. And so just making these decisions constantly, just what are the items that are currently inside the building, those didn't overall eliminate the overall decisions that are being made by inserters. And then the circuit network update time was pretty high. Again, still, I'm running all 16 threads and 8 cores for this, so if I had more threads, maybe it would have helped. But when you think about it, there's an isolated network here, so every single one of these designs has way more networks that exist, and we can see that if we look at the networks, the circuit network numbers. You can see there's 5444. This is all green because it's all this one centralized, but then the reds are all different. So 6100, 6053, 6051. So that means that there's, you know, each one has its own network that it's constantly making decisions on. And so all those networks need to be updated, and that overall hurt this design. That's the main thing that is my takeaway for this particular design. For what ultimately hurt in the end was just, again, kind of that common pattern of overusing circuits and some of those concepts there. So that's design number 19. So the next design that we have to talk about is one of my personal favorites. This is design number 15 from you. I had the most fun trying to make this benchmark work. It turned out this was really not easy to do if you wanted to clone it. So you can clone the trains, you can do all that. The problem that came into play was that in an isolated network, these originally had a train limit that was set on them. But the moment that you created another copy of an isolated rail network, it would deadlock because they'd be waiting at one of these stations to get to a train that had already a limit that was set, and it could just never reach it because it would kind of have this alert show up. They can't find a path to destination because they would be looking across all of the train stations that existed. They still do that because they all share the same name. So in theory, you could give them all individual names. I was not going to be bothered with doing that because the sheer number of stations I would have had to individually name was 1,344 stations to make this happen. So we kept it as is, as agreed. So also, yeah, there's 1,920 trains in this map. Why is there 1,920 trains? Well, in order to always have one train ready to go and to continue to go into the next station here, you needed always a redundant train so that there's constant production. And that's where this buffer here is just for the timing difference between this train coming in and the other train going and exiting out. And it's actually a really cool concept. Like, what this does is it will wind up actually crafting, and what I liked about it is that it's directly inserting, using electric mining drill, directly into the plastic bar. So you'd have to have this on a coal patch. And then it actually transfers across using filters for everything, the plastic. I thought that was just a cool thing. You got plastic kind of come across here, comes into here, and then passes it back and forth. And there's no inserter clocking or anything like that, but it's just using direct insertion. And so if you look at the actual numbers for this particular design, you'll see that, okay, yeah, the trains is using the majority of update time, but it actually reduced the entity update time because it's all fully direct insertion. There's no belts at all involved in this science. So, but if you look at the baseline and then you compare it to this, there's a very obvious, very different functional signature of this design, and it's just trains. So this kind of goes into, and I love this design because it really highlights the reason why trains need a buff desperately. The fact that we need to have 20 trains to make 240 items per second, if you want to do direct insertion in this way, is kind of ludicrous. So if we could have basically these cargo wagons that were 4 times the size, you can craft sulfur in almost an instant and completely fill this train. So this is not an issue for that. So the train stop time isn't a problem. You could buffer into chest the advanced circuits and then instantly fill everything up, which is the legendary inserters. So you could reduce the number of trains that you wind up having in the network drastically, because you could just be constantly producing and just have larger chests to actually bring the items around. Even though this design is literally using legendary nuclear fuel, and I accepted it even though it's not in the rules because it's just such a unique way of doing this, and I thought it would be interesting to share with everyone. So, really cool concept, and I still use the original bus that I had to go and send all the values across it, like basically to get it everywhere. So, really cool concept using this, like basically just trains in general, and I really like that it's just all nicely doing a good job of not over beaconing anything, and you can especially see that here. There's really no need for an extra beacon around this chemical plant. Here it just happens to be sharing it, just because of the sheer fact of how close these are. But that's a good thing, is like there's no reason to beacon this anymore, just because the sheer volume of plastic that you're going to get out of this is already just high enough with max productivity where we're at. So I don't have a lot of comments on what I would improve about the design, but just to reiterate, what I thought was interesting is seeing trains on this scale, having this many trains all running like this, constantly running in a network, all cloned, all running in like short succession, and constantly delivering material, and that it actually could work in an isolated network like this, as long as you just are really clever about where you wind up putting the rail signals, and then ultimately just making sure that there are no train limits. Otherwise they will constantly be waiting on trying to get here, and it'll just never be able to because there's no path, because they're isolated rail networks. Anyway, so thank you for this design. I had probably the most fun actually putting this one together. Yeah, that happens sometimes, then it goes away eventually. This only happens when they have complete back pressure like this. So then they have literally nowhere to go, and they're looking at all of them. Anyway, yeah, so pretty cool concept. Next design is design 16 from you. So fascinatingly enough, this particular design performed actually worse than the train build that we just saw. And just because of the sheer number of space platforms, which so apparently silo chesting and in a kind of like looking at it this way is actually worse than trains. In this context, that's not definitive, but like in a nutshell, it's kind of true. So one of the things that's just interesting is just like looking at this like with ships versus having no ships. Oops, that's the wrong design. So looking at here, like the difference here, you can just see the inflation that comes from adding those ships. So I looked a little bit more into it, mainly just as I've been reviewing this design again. So I checked a thing here, which was like, hey, let me check the update time on space platforms just to make sure that that's the case. So you can see that the space platform update time here is 0.7 milliseconds, basically. And so if I go here, and even I was just like, hey, what happens if I just remove all these extra things? So just make sure that there are no even like ability for these to be like requesting anything. They're just paused sitting here, right? So just doing this specifically, does this make any difference? And if you look at the space platform update time, it made no difference at all. So then just existing seems to make a difference. And more specifically, if we look at this and I go through the surfaces and I start deleting them. So let's go back over here to novice, and we'll have basically the F5 statistics so we can look at it. So we can just see how much it makes an impact as the ships start going away. But I think that's the most interesting part for me, was just the impact that had from this. So if I go here to this space platform, and let's go ahead and delete it. we're going to see that now the space platform update time has dropped already. And let's go and delete this surface here. And let's go, we're looking at right now 0.6, delete it. Now we are at 0.5. So you're seeing a direct correlation that as we start deleting them, right, you start seeing that update time consistently just going down. So seems like the number of space platforms that you have, and just to make this even worse, you can go and create all these basically extra space platforms here. And actually in like a real base, if you had like, you know, several of these, by the way, you can just press shift to instantly create all these. You now see that with all those extra ships that are up there, if this will go away, the space platform update time, well, I'll wait until this goes away. But like, this is kind of hard to see, but we are at like 1.3 now. So immediately this is just shot up. So it just gets worse and worse the more ships that are directly you can correlate with the number of ships that you have are increasing basically the space platform update time. So that's directly contributed to the build. The cool parts about this build, though, that I do want to highlight is it's the only one in this particular that we're going to talk about today that's using recipe switching. This is actually a really good concept. What it allows you to do is just switch between steel and occasionally with the pipes and swap between them. So that's actually really cool because you don't, especially like here with the particular research that we have max steel productivity. So there's no reason to even put productivity anymore in the foundries, so just switching between them just occasionally when needed already reduces the number of foundries you wind up needing. So I don't have a whole bunch of feedback to give here. The only things that I would say is just kind of similar to the last one. What would be cool is just tiling this in a way so that there's a little bit more beacon sharing, but that's not the problem. There's already like an overall improvement from the actual design compared to the baseline. It's just the cargo, basically using the rocket silos as a chest is what hurt it ultimately in the end. So it's a cool design. I think like that's just like the main culprit, and the main thing that I really gained out of this was just looking at like, yeah, wow, that's crazy to see just how much of a sheer impact the actual silo chests have in isolation. So before we get into Mind Builder's build, I want to kind of leave that towards the end because it's such a huge total deviation from everything that we've seen, and it's worth kind of exploring for a while just due to it's kind of just an art piece. So I'm going to talk real quick about Swift Death 07's build. So this design is basically a combination of the problems that went wrong with Swift Death 07 design number 4 and Tota 1. Where there's just so many entities, and basically it's just the combination of both the problems that happened here. So if we look at it here for this particular design, and we look at it, it's the same concept of kind of that modular approach that we wound up seeing, but the main issue that kind of comes about is just that you have just so many, again, just so many buildings to produce 240 items per second. So very similar. We have 150 foundries. You have one building for every single material you need, and then just crafting one science, and there's not a lot of beacons around it. So that's kind of the main issue, is that the cargo wagon's cool because it can hold everything, but it ultimately, the issue that kind of comes about is just that it can't, there's too many buildings that ultimately are all just inserting, and it's also using that core concept of all the items are clocked. So there's so many inserters that are all active all the time. So every single item for every single tick for 540 inserters are active constantly. So that's why it is such a huge outlier compared to everything else. So then a little bit more in depth, in detail, you look at it, it just has everything high. So entity updates high, trains are updated very high, and then ultimately like the fluid flow is very high, very similar to the previous design that we saw, where there is, and let's actually go and pull that up just so we can compare this one that I'm interested in talking about, so 04, and then let's talk about also Tota 1, because they're all kind of similar, and so this kind of helps, I think, overall explain the similarities and issues. So again, just looking at the signatures here, and this is in order of performance. So if you look at this one, so this one had a very high control behavior update time. This version here has now a lot of train updates, but then the electric circuit fluid flow is very high just due to the sheer number of entities that exist. That same signature is basically present here in terms of order of magnitude, just expanded more. Because now all of those inserters, the main benefit that Total 1 had was that he was just sending a pulse signal for all the inserters, and then Swift Death on his design here is using it for every single tick, so all the entities are constantly active. So now this has more inserters than this design had, but at least these were clocked, and so this is showing you just the sheer impact of that particular control strategy and why it just ultimately doesn't work. So, and why it's better to guard the actual signals. So, and then again, yeah, just using too many trains as long arms, there is a cost to that, as you're seeing on an every single tick basis. So, less is more. That is still going to be the case, and choosing the right clocking strategy really matters for, ultimately, for these designs that you wind up seeing. So just, that would be just the feedback that I have here on why this design ultimately just didn't wind up performing all that well. And just that kind of hopefully summarizes all the main issues that deviated to make the designs worse than just making a single belted, like, traditional simple setup. This leads me to the final design that we're going to talk about today. So this is the most unique design. We've had actually a couple unique designs, so I can't really say that, but there's a lot of unique things that this design does, and actually does really well. So one of the things that it's doing is it actually has an isolated value that kind of comes across the circuit network here. It tells all these inserters to swing just only once. So it does a really good job of just only occasionally sending a value. You can see all these inserters swinging at the same time. The downside, and why I could not create the number of copies that I wanted, is that there's 3,000 burner inserters per build here. So where we talked about it before, right, with the baseline build having a total of 147 total inserters, this has, yeah, well, 3,000. Now they are legendary, so I'll give it that. But the downside is just ultimately that number that are all swinging. So it's actually doing a really good job of, like, isolating the circuit network in general here. And it's doing this in a really cool way. You can see how there's all these little builds here, and this had to be, like, very tightly designed to, like, just one time initiate and create this. And this is really cool. It's using the concept of belts and their speeds to determine when it's actually going to pick something up. And this is pretty cool to go and look at. And so you can see, like, when they're monitoring for a network signal here. So if we look at, like, the values that are coming across here, you see just for, like, even like a couple ticks, it's like just barely enough for this to swing. It'll get a small signal for this this copper plate that's here. And so there's a lot of these, like, individual little clocks all throughout this build. And this is so... I can't imagine the amount of time it took to get these exactly right and set this up perfectly. Because, like, you could do this with a traditional clock and a decider combinator and doing all that, but I just find this such a cool concept because you see these clocks all over the place. So here's all the clocks, and they're just sending a value, and they're just all propagating here to each of the individual ones that are just kind of saying, like, hey, I need to go and grab a item for the grabbing the engine units. And the fact that this actually works and consistently produces 240 items per second and passes pretty much all the tests that I actually have, I find this just like an amazing build. I'm just kind of blown away that this was created, and I understand that. So my builder who created this, like, yeah, it's a challenge run that he's doing, and would you use this in a mega base? Absolutely not. You like, if you have access to late game tech, go and use it. But it's doing everything that it can. So for the things that aren't burners, it's going to use the max, basically, that it can. So lots of belt weaving, lots of really good, like, beacon placement, just absolutely getting the most that it can out of these, because these are constantly needed to be crafting at this rate. So, and you can just see just here, like, it can't benefit from stacking the belts, so it has to just run so many belts here. So, and you can see that here, right? You need to run 4 of these belts instead of just running 1 if they were stacked, and it's just, you can't use it if you're using burner inserters. So some of these just, like, really unique concepts of of doing this. Now, one thing that I proposed is if you wanted to cut the swing time substantially across these, you could use a different fuel source other than coal. So just provide the best fuel you can, and after talking to them, like you could provide like either legendary rocket fuel, and then these things would just stay active for a really long time. So then they wouldn't have to swing quite as often to pick double up coal and the individual items that it needs here for iron. And you could use that also, that same fuel source, for burning coal inside here, so there'd be less swings overall. So that'd be like the first thing that I would do if I had to run this and I had to really scale the science up and be constrained to burner inserters. But that's what I'd wind up doing if I'd make any improvement. If you look at like the wake list, there's a couple that are just excessive here on the top, and I haven't quite done the math if they're necessary or not, honestly, because it's just this is kind of overwhelming me, this build. So like when it's smelting, there's a couple of these like here that just happen to just be constantly output blocks. So it seems like there's a couple over ratioed items here for steel plates. And you can see like here, this is output block. So like you could remove a couple of these and remove them from the inserter, like the overall network in general. And that would be completely fine just to kind of do that. So that would probably be the only other improvement I'd make here. Otherwise, like, this design is kind of wild because it has to, there's extra things that this has to do just to provide and get coal to come in here. So it's doing direct insertion, but then it has to leverage and occasionally bring coal in. And you can see that, you know, this is going to occasionally grab coal and bring it over into this one just to continue to fuel it. So I find that also kind of cool that that exists. So again, just like running for the energy portion of this would be better spent potentially if you have another fuel source. This has the lowest power consumption across all the builds, hands down. Now, okay, it's trading that energy cost for literally UPS and coal consumption. The consumption of coal on this particular map is absolutely wild. 25,000 coal per minute. Compared to most of the other designs that are just absolutely just sipping coal. So, yeah, and there's a couple other things. Is like if you actually happen to get to the point where you have plastic bar productivity at 30, then you could just make this all just speed modules, so that would save a little bit of time, but not necessarily really. Like, I don't think you're really going to need to do that. So, just again, the fact that all the clocks across this whole build, there's really kudos to this. This actually does a really good job of just circuit controlling everything, and that shows up here in the graph. You can see that like the control behavior update time is actually pretty low on this particular build. So, like if you look at it here, like this is kind of that difference between like even just using legendary tech like we just saw with the last design that we talked about. If you limit the number of decisions and just send a single tick, that's just so much better. So. And yes, this is 1/12 the scale, so keep that in mind. But like, that is a thing that overall makes this so that even though like the ratio here of entity update time to circuit update time is still substantially reduced. Like I can't imagine what this would look like if you did not have any clocking at all. And yeah, so it's a really cool design. I don't know if there's, and this actually makes an interesting question. I don't know if this is inherently better to do something like this and remove a decider, a combinator, and a clock, and instead just basically having a looping belt like this to determine time. It may be useful, but I don't know enough about how this even works. So it's there's the nerd aspect of me wants to go and dive into this, so it's so I'll leave this as a challenge. If anyone wants to figure this out and actually clock the differences and do some like actual performance testing around it, I'd highly welcome it. I myself don't personally want to like at the moment go and invest the time into it because I like my simple clock that I can set down and not figure out the timings of this. But really impressive design. The fact that this is even existing is really cool. So I'll leave this as I close out the video. I'm going to showcase this build actually starting up because I think it's got one of the coolest kind of startup sequences that I've seen. So pause the game here, I'm going to start this, and what we're going to do is I have the debug setting turned on to show the transport line gaps, that we can actually go and monitor as this completely fills the entirety of the build, and then goes all the way through. It has a startup sequence, initiates all the clocks, and hopefully this can all just kind of be showcased here as we have an outro. So enjoy this as this goes and all slowly starts up. So, in conclusion, where we're at, we've got 20 designs that are going to continue on to the next stage. So the plan is, going forward, the next round we're going to be running for a lot more tests for all of them. So I haven't quite decided on how many ticks and how many runs, but I'll decide that before the next video is released. So you're just going to have to wait until next time for that. But the overall thoughts that I have here is just kind of like, this is kind of showing like the ones that are performing below the baseline, and those are the ones I focus on today, are just using some core concepts like guarding and like networks and inserters is good, like just sending one value, and the best case is just having no values and sending one. Second thing is like over beaconing and having too many entities. So like direct insertion is good, but you have to be like, just try to share as many beacons as you can. So kind of creating these small little modules is a bad pattern, as happened in most of the designs that got created, that it overall just didn't help in overall reducing the entity update time. It actually just made it worse, so in a lot of cases. So, and another thing that you're seeing too here is we got a quick sneak preview that it seems like the best performing design, at least in this particular round, actually was using cargo wagons as chesting, so it seems like that's a good way to do it. But when just from observation, and we'll see this later on in the other designs, like those top 3 designs that existed all have 3 totally different philosophies and different tricks on how they're doing things. One's direct and like, anyway, I don't want to give or go too far into that because that's not the point of this video. But like the main thing that I'm kind of trying to draw from this is like the lessons learned here is like for really, really fast buildings that are just overall just like way over the speed of the consumption of the building that they're directly inserting into, adding more beacons that just only target that one building just won't help you in the end. So having something that will, in the end, like just trying to reuse a beacon to touch as many things as possible is going to reduce that every 120 ticks, it making a decision itself. So there's kind of a balancing act here is kind of where I'm getting to. And I think like as we go through this science series, as we get now, this is the first much more complicated design that exists. The following ones, so like getting into military science, especially purple and yellow science, are going to be like almost completely layout dependent. The optimizations that we're going to see is going to be like at a bare minimum to perform, like you need to be able to guard like the inserters that you're sending values to. So that's like otherwise you're going to perform below the baseline. That's something that you just need to do. Reduce the decisions inserters are making. Use wakeless, actually, I'd even encourage if you're going to wind up using like really fast recipes, like if you're just constantly producing from one building, like just use wakeless. Like the inserters are going to have to do something every time that a craft is happening, so there's no reason to add a circuit overhead. Circuit overhead does exist. There's like basically for 6 ticks every second, it's going to have to make a decision because it's just checking anyway, agnostic, so to make a decision. So there is an overhead related to circuits. Another thing that we talked about, your performance may vary on your particular design, or in all these designs on your particular hardware. So if you really want to know which of these designs were the best, just take all the designs and all the save files I have and run the benchmark yourself. So that's all exists on GitHub. You can do it yourself if you want to, and clone it and run it yourself if you're interested. If you have a similar architecture to me, so 7800X3D or 9800X3D processor, you're probably going to see the same like general correlation between these designs as we go through this series. So that's something just to keep in mind. If you have less cores, less threads than I do, then you may want to use one that uses less circuits. As we saw with some of the designs that use less circuits, just overall did better, and then transport line time has a much higher cost. My machine, it doesn't because of just the number of threads that I have. So these are all just kind of like my current thoughts on this. This is a cool series for me. I'm having a lot of fun actually going through this. It is a lot of work. I'm not going to underestimate that. I think when I first got into this, I did not expect just the sheer amount of interest that people have and just thank you to every single person that submitted a design. I'm really excited to see the results. I haven't run them yet. I'm purposefully just keeping this in line with everyone else. I could go pre-run all the benchmarks and know the end results, but I kind of want to join the experience. So also, all the designers that submitted something are seeing their results for the first time in this particular video. So that's a difference than as before, where I used to release it just so that everyone could see it on Discord beforehand. So thank everyone for bearing with that. And so I've talked here for a while. You can just see just absolutely how long this build takes to go and actually start up. So let's just let's kick this into high gear and let's get this to actually go and start up. But anyway, if you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for following along. Basically, just subscribing, liking the channel, that stuff really helps out for me to kind of continue to create these like really complicated videos and in-depth designs. It takes a lot of work. There's a lot of effort that goes into actually going and building and producing, editing, coordinating all the different competitions like this. So if you like this kind of stuff and you want to support it, just subscribing just helps out the channel a lot and keeps me motivated to keep on doing these things. So appreciate it. Appreciate especially, again, all the designers that have participated. Not been afraid to go and have their designs showcased and critiqued on YouTube. And at the end of the day, I'm just an engineer trying to just make his way through the universe and take what I say with a grain of salt. I'm trying to base my understanding and improve my understanding of how to build mega bases, and I'm taking you along for the ride for it. So hopefully we find some interesting things along the way, and I'm excited for the next part in the next episode of this series. So subscribe if you want to see the second part. Until then, I'll see you next time.